we should begin our session today. And I was just saying to Sarah, this has been such a rich conversation. I wish we were continuing, and because it really has been good. We are recording the conversations, and so they'll be ready and available if anyone wants to use them for future um, dialogue in your churches. That would be wonderful to be able to do. And we'll send Sarah just a note to say if we can do some posting in the Valley Bridge today, pointing people to this last episode, as I think it really does relate to where we are, and just a couple of days before the next presidential election. And so as we prepare toward that, I think that her episode 8 really helps us to get a good framework. So Sarah, we're going to turn it over to you, and thank you again for sharing with us this morning.
Absolutely. Well, happy to be here, and I'm going to kind of follow the same pattern as we have. And there's a smaller group today, so we may just be able to kind of talk and ask some questions back and forth, which is great. I don't have a ton planned, but again, I'm happy to kind of talk through, and particularly if there were things that were unclear or you want me to expand upon. But maybe just to start, I know you're all busy and have lots of things going on, so probably haven't had a lot of time to think. So I'm going to just start again with these questions. These are, again, those metacognition questions to help us get a sense of where we were and where we are now. So just a couple of minutes, I'll set my timer here, and think through either, you can write down or think through these questions. What did you think you knew about the history of Christianity and race in the United States before either these last few episodes or before this whole thing? What did you learn? So big ideas or small details. And what was the most challenging to learn, and why has it been the most challenging? Just a couple minutes.
So one of the things you said, if I might begin.
Yeah, please, jump right in.
I never thought of history as competing true stories with one another. And since George Floyd, I have read, my goodness, people have given me all kinds of books. And I have had that in the back of my mind as I've been reading these books, that, the first question I had is, why was I never taught this? And then you made that statement about history as competing true stories. And so there is a competition, and I'm wrestling with that in my mind. It makes me wonder about other stories that I'm struggling with. And so that's been the thing that I've learned the most, is the competing true stories. Now, I know that even in biblical, how the canon was put together, all that, I understand that, but I just had never heard that comment that way. And so I thank you for that.
Yeah. I think that is, I mean, there are multiple layers to that. I know as a historian, that is, to me, one of kind of the basic realities of my life, and one of the hardest things to communicate when people start talking about history sometimes. I think there are so many people for whom history is simply a collection of facts, and the facts don't change. And so if you tell them a story that's different than the facts that they learned, I mean, again, I think there are parallels here with real biblical literalism, right? So for people who've told that the Bible just says these things, and anybody who says differently is like interpreting the Bible in new and dangerous ways, and they can't see their own interpretation. I think sometimes that happens with history too. So people have learned a set of facts, and they've been told that those are just facts. Right? Now, they weren't just facts. They were put in a story, because we're narrative creatures, right? We're always putting things in stories. Even the choosing of the facts is part of a narrative. Someone's choosing I mean, someone in my, you know, grade school and junior high days decided that we needed to spend a lot of time learning about the Pilgrims. Even as an American religious historian, I know that the people who landed at Plymouth in 1620 really were pretty minor characters in the American story. Like, they were not, if we were going to talk about people coming from England, those even were the right ones to talk about. But like, somebody decided that like my ability to make buttermilk and put on a little hat was a huge, like, these things that I had to learn. So when you come back to people and say, you know, that's not quite how the story is, I think their impulse is, well, you're just denying the facts.
Right.
Even though you know, they weren't just learning facts either. So that's a really, it's a tough one. And then we're always learning more in history, right? We're going back and we're looking, or we're seeing new documents, or, you know, we're understanding things in new ways, and people think, well, you've just changed it. And you're like, well, no, I mean, it's like any other thing. We're learning more, but that's hard when people have their narrative. Other things on that, or other kind of things that have been important for your learning, or have been challenging, that have been most helpful, least helpful?
Parallel to what you've just been talking about, in many conversations I've had recently, is on the discussion of how many COVID cases there are, whether to wear a mask or not. People are just throwing up their hands and saying, I don't know who to believe. Yep. Yeah, so there's and this is a larger kind of cultural piece, but there's at least a line of thinking in American history and American religious history that there's a deep impulse in kind of the American psyche, and it goes way back, that you should trust common people more than experts. And that you know, the common people are closer to the truth than experts. And so, and that can play in a couple of ways. So to go back to our race discussion a little bit, one of the arguments, and I said this in an earlier video, for why the early Methodists and Baptists were able to evangelize so well in kind of frontier America, but also among African-American communities, is because they believed in the spiritual authority of common people, which meant that you didn't have to have a degree from Yale or Harvard in order to be a minister. You needed a conversion experience and and the ability to preach, but common people could do that. So in one ways, it was really democratizing, right? It gave access to religious authority to people who would have had no other way to access it, right? On the other hand, Jim, to go back to what you're saying too, it opened up the religious world to a lot of people who I think many of us today here, as good mainline Presbyterians, would say were not perhaps the most reliable religious authorities. Right? You got a lot of people, and starting in the 19th century, predicting the imminent return of Christ and producing big charts on that, because they knew as well as anybody, or and all of those things. And so I think that runs through American religion. It runs through American politics. This kind of dual thing where that sense of there's all this information out there, and anybody on the internet can have a good theory. And then you have, our epidemiologist saying, okay, but your Facebook post is not the same thing as, my PhD. And then people coming back and sort of having that very American response of like, well, who are you to tell me, to wear a mask? Why does your PhD give you the authority to do that? And again, sometimes that's been really democratizing in helpful ways. And sometimes, public health crisis, its effects are not perhaps as good.
Well, back to the race thing, I wonder why it took I mean, I think of my age and not really ever knowing the whole story of that Tulsa massacre.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why did that get left out of the history books? And so then they begin to look at who is editing the history books. And I heard at one time that there was an underlying need to perpetuate certain things. And so certain things were left out.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yes. Textbooks are an interesting case. There are multiple factors here, and there are lots of different kinds of textbooks. But to go back to Darren's comment about the multiple stories, right? So certainly, and in some ways in the expert issue too. So one of the issues around textbooks is that the textbook market is a market. Okay. And certain players in that market have a lot of buying power. And usually the one that gets named here is Texas. Texas is a big state with a lot of schools. And so writing a textbook in a way where it could get approval, in multiple markets has been a priority, right? And there are, I think it's fair to say, there has been a lot of resistance in some markets, and this isn't just Southern markets, but certainly it's true of Southern markets, to talking about kind of the history of slavery or the history of racial relationships in this country in ways that, say, I would consider accurate. The other thing is that again, public schools are public, and they're both kind of run by experts, right? Teachers with expertise in fields, and by localities, school boards, and school boards are who wins.
Mm-hmm.
My father, who is a lifelong educator, is laughing right now because, right? I mean, and you all know, like, you work on church boards, so you know how this goes, right? Like, you get stuck with the person with the most votes or the person who says yes. And some of those folks, I mean, there has been one of the things that has happened in the last 40 or 50 years is that there has been, in some places, a real concerted effort to kind of control things like school boards at a local level. Oftentimes that concern for controlling school boards at a local level also has a particular political position. And again, in a lot of places, that's been a pretty racially conservative one, if you want to put it that way. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of reasons, Jan. The other thing is that, I mean, to go back again to the multiple stories, is that historians go through, if you want to talk about this, moods and trends. In the 1950s and 1960s, historians were really focusing on what we called consensus history, or thinking about the history that told the story of us, kind of the good us.
The good us.
And so that's not a Tulsa massacre story. Mm-hmm. It's not a story about North Carolina having a coup in 1898, right? I mean, and so some of that too is what people decide is the story that they're going to tell at a particular moment, and then that trickles down from historians who tell it to publishers. I mean, all of those things. So yeah, I think there's just a lot that people don't know. And then back to what we were saying before, when you tell them, I think there is, for some people, kind of this sense of betrayal and not wanting to fit the new information into their existing cognitive map. The country where the Tulsa massacre could happen, I think for some people is not the country they want to live in. So it's easier to say that's new or that's being, blown out of proportion. It's easier to do that than to put it into the map.
I wonder about the Tulsa residents themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How many in Oklahoma know that? Is it all well known, or just the people in Tulsa, or how many people in Tulsa that came later learned about it?
I don't know. My guess, I mean, this sounds a little snide, but I'll say it.
My guess is about the same proportion of people who know about how anti-Semitic Minneapolis was in the 1930s, or who are really well versed in the 1862 hanging in Mankato, which is to say not a lot.
Well, and the hanging in Duluth. I mean,
yeah.
from those
yeah. I mean, a lot of that stuff has recently gotten more attention, but again, you're talking about generations of people for whom those just weren't things that were talked about. So yeah, absolutely.
I was just thinking about contrasting American history and American mythology to kind of biblical history and biblical mythology with regards to kind of the canonization of the Hebrew scriptures by priests and scribes in Babylon, who made this story, which, you know, may have had some historical factness to it, but probably largely history-ish, you know, about exile from Egypt, right? And which was a story of salvation from empire and a return home. But I think, you know, one of the differences is that in the biblical narrative, they also had to explain how it is that they were exiled in the first place. Like, they had to come up with a story of their own disobedience before God, and a story of their own deliverance back home. So a story of sin and grace, right? But the American story is supposed to be a story of victory, of just God's grace. And I don't think sort of American mythology has in it a sense of, to be generous, like the tragic nature of the lives of nations, right? We're supposed to be the heroes who win victoriously with God on our side, not a people who, you know, are also stained by sin at a very profound level. And I wonder if that's why it's particularly difficult in the United States to come to terms with our own history.
No, I think that's interesting. Before I jump in, other people have thoughts on that?
Yeah. Sarah, I thought you said something quite significant when you talked about being honest with our history and still believing there's a God of grace who will continue to love us. That grace, that a gift of grace is self-correction.
Yeah, I think one of the, you know, the things about the biblical story is that sense of sin and that sense of grace. And, you know, I think one of the things that happens in American history is it's not clear how grace would work for a nation, right? So I think that's part of it. And it's interesting the moments where, you've had people talk in more of those kind of explicitly biblical terms, and the way then that ends up not holding long term. To me, one of the classic examples of this is Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is very short. They etched it into the wall at the Lincoln Monument. It's that short. And it's just a remarkable address, because Lincoln says, it's 1865. The Civil War isn't over, but it's won. It's clear his side has won. So you'd think that what he would do there, right, is talk about how great America was and how, you know, we did this thing and we're ready to move on. And what he does in the second inaugural is he says, you know, as a nation, we read the same Bible and we pray to the same God, and yet we've had this horrible civil war. And we have to at least acknowledge the possibility that the reason that God has allowed this civil war to happen is because God is demanding that every, I'm going to get the words wrong because he's a better speaker than this, but he says that every lash with the whip will have to be paid for by the sword, and that this is God's judgment on all of us. Now, that has some theological, I wouldn't necessarily go with Abraham Lincoln's theology there, but it's an amazing moment to me of an can you imagine if any American leader at the end of a war stood up and said, well, you know, maybe this happened and the people who died because we really screwed up and God was punishing us. I mean, it would be an outrage. And that's really what he says. And then he's assassinated, and the country doesn't, for the most part, you know, engage in decades-long kind of self-critical evaluation, right? There's a kind of a moment in Reconstruction where there are some people kind of wanting to go that direction, but what ends up happening instead is the South claims moral victory, the North claims victory, and they decide to kind of join back together in this project of kind of national expansion, and they end up disenfranchising Black people again. But back to your point, Andy and Jim, it's an amazing kind of what if moment, right? Where Abraham Lincoln, who I think is our only president who wasn't an official member of a church, but who was probably our most biblical president in the sense that I think he probably of the presidents had the most of the Bible memorized and just sort of had its stories embedded in him, how he was trying to process that. I mean, and then Martin Luther King Jr. is another good example, right? Of someone who really did talk in very biblical terms about judgment and then the possibility of grace. But we don't talk about the Martin Luther King of judgment, right? We talk about the really the king of, you know, I mean, today a lot of times it's color blindness. So yeah. Other things, big or small, or clarifications you noticed, things that still don't make sense or you want some more on?
I just thought your summary of the current situation in video 8 was...
A what?
I thought your summary of where we are today in the 8th video was both helpful and discouraging. I mean, I think it rings true, like it seems to describe things as they are, but it seems like we're confronted with two cohesive but incompatible worldviews. Mm-hmm. And one of my real concerns is that these two worldviews are driving we're splitting a church again too, I think. Mm-hmm. Or we're splitting Christianity again. Mm-hmm. Or I worry about that a lot. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's hard to, I mean, how do you put...
Right. Yeah. Before I talk a little bit about that, others, did that ring true for your experience too? The episode 8 kind of where we are, did that seem what you're seeing? Yeah.
I have a note on that in the notes that I took, and I'm not sure. I agree with Andy very much, but this is what I wrote as I was taking notes on it. I said, I'm curious on whether this is a place in which you, meaning you, Sarah, and I actually differ in opinion, or if it's just a wrinkle you chose not to include. But personally, I see a lot of the problems in the South-North religious, secular, liberal, conservative divides as firmly, deeply, and intractably rooted in the fundamentalist modernist controversy, something that has, in my opinion, not yet been sorted in the church. And I think that to me is something that I always go back to, and I think there are a lot of worldview things and there's a lot of us and them language that kind of is wrapped up in those things. But I so much see that having spilled over into so many aspects of life and so many ideas of like how to analyze a text. I mean, like that's, to me, that's like, and I think maybe it's a chicken egg thing. Maybe it's like, well, the fundamentalist modernist controversy grows out of this worldview issue, or does the worldview issue grow out of that? I don't know. But I noticed that you didn't address that specifically in episode 8, but it was something that I was thinking about like the whole episode, partly because you assigned in one of your classes, or at least you used to, Summer of the Gods, which I did not take a class from you, but Carissa did, and I borrowed her book and read it. So, and that is an excellent book, but I would say has like, that's for those who haven't read that, it's a book about the Scopes trial, the monkey trial, and is one of those books that even though it's about 100 years ago, you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that's now, like that's, but anyway, I guess that was the thing that I felt was I didn't see in episode 8 that I just was on my mind the whole time.
Yeah, no, so just to air that out a little bit. So the question is, does the controversy in the 19 teens and 1920s between the fundamentalists and the modernists that, among other things, splits Northern Presbyterians, right, and Northern Baptists, how does that factor into all of this? And so I think I think it's another layer. And I guess I think that in a couple ways. So I would say it's related. The thing about that controversy is it wasn't a Southern controversy for the most part. The South is much more on the fundamentalist side, and there's not a lot of, other pushing. And so a related question, again, to go back to the chicken and egg, is how much of that controversy is a stand-in for things that are also about race and gender, right? And how much does race and gender become like an outgrowth of that controversy? And I think that there are probably a couple of different ways to read that. I think one of the things I would say, I'm gonna try this out, is that I think the issue about reading texts, I think is important here, right? In terms of that controversy, as it had been in the 19th century. Ways of reading texts that really enshrine whatever the status quo is, versus ways of reading texts that are a little bit more open, right? I think that is something that's kind of part of an ongoing conversation. And I think go back to Andy's point, one of the ways that gets framed is the people who read them in a more kind of literal or status quo way tend to describe themselves as being the really religious people, and the people who are having a more open reading as being the less religious people, for lack of a better term, right? And I think one of the reframings is thinking about the people who are reading it a little bit more openly as saying, we're not trying to just, comport our reading to modern culture, right? But what we're trying to do is to give space to the Holy Spirit and to the experience of people who aren't like us, right? Or to the readings of people who aren't like us. That one of the things that fundamentalist modernist controversy does is it gives a lot of power of reading and the authority of reading to a pretty homogenous group of people, who then get to say, well, if you don't share our reading, it's not because we're limited or we have a particular perspective, it's just that you're reading it wrong, right? Where I think on the other side, you have people who, sometimes I think are just trying to kind of like have the least embarrassing Christianity possible, which is not a project I have a whole lot of time for. Like if I'm going to get up on Sunday morning, like I might as well have a really dense Christian story. I'm fine with that. But having a broader reading where you're really trying to say like, my reading could be wrong and I need other people to help me and I need the Holy Spirit to help me to read this. So yeah, David, that's an interesting lens to put on it in terms of some of what's going on there. Yeah.
When I listened to episode 8, one of the things that stuck out to me was how people landed in the way that they voted. And as a person of color, it was easy for me to be able to see clearly the demarcations. People vote this way or they vote that way. And I think the episode really helped me to think about, so when people choose to vote a different way, what is it that has changed in their minds? Mm-hmm. And not saying that you've got to be tied in to one side or the other. I'm not saying that. But what was interesting is to see how people decided to vote. So for people of color, I think it was in episode 7, you began to talk about how legislation really made the difference. It wasn't just changing the hearts of people. I think Billy Graham said, you know, people's hearts have to change, but you said, no, it's legislation that changes, and therefore we see things happen differently in society. And I wondered how many people really do fall into that category to believe that if you could only change a person's heart. And I think that there's something to that.
Sure.
It is something to that, because I always say you can't legislate morality. And when I say that, I'm not talking about who's in bed with who. Mm-hmm. I mean, really, when it comes to issues of justice and those type of things, what I did think you really highlighted in chapter 8 is where we are falling now and what I see happening. So you said you did that video back in June.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking how true it is in October, just days before the election, that what we're seeing is that people really taking sides. Mm-hmm. And I saw it, I was on Southern Kansas Presbytery looking for this resource yesterday, and there was this disturbing collage of pictures. Mm-hmm. And I looked at it and I thought, let me look at this a second time. But there was a small caption that said, who will the church be after the election? Hmm. And that was the point of this collage. I mean, it really did show a lot of different people in different places, and some that was very disturbing. But I think that that's a big question for us as we think about who we are as a church. Mm-hmm. How will these issues divide us? Mm-hmm. And will we be so divided that we won't find some common commonalities that bring us back together as a Church of Jesus Christ? And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know, but that's what kind of raised in my mind listening to or viewing episodes 7 and 8.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, to both of those questions, or to all of them, I think, I mean, one of the questions that's always in the back of my head, and I want to be really careful here because it's a dangerous question, but it's in the back of my head, is when we talk about the church dividing or the church splitting, is there a point at which we're saying, or we're willing to say, or willing to name, you have beliefs that are so antithetical to the gospel that we're not actually part of the same project? Now, I want to be really careful there. I mean, I think the kind of the church universal, I think, said that twice in the 20th century. It said that once to the German Christians, which David knows a lot about, and then once to the Reformed Church in South Africa that had theologized apartheid. Right? I mean, so that kind of what some people call status confessionis, right? Where you say, like, what you're saying is you're at the point where you are denying the central confession of Christianity, which is that Jesus is Lord. And you're either denying it by saying that Hitler is Lord, or you're denying it by saying that basically whiteness is Lord, right? In South Africa. So I don't want to say that we're there yet. But I always want to be a little bit careful. I'm brought back to that moment in early Methodism, early American Methodism, where the Methodists came over, right, with this very strong anti-slavery stance. Like, you couldn't be a slave owner and be a Methodist because they just didn't see it as compatible with Christianity. And then in 6 months, they decided to change the rule because they realized that they weren't going to be able to convert white slave owners or have access to slaves. And I get that, like, right? They were right. Like, there would be no Methodist movement in America today, probably, if they had done it. Or it'd be like the Quakers, very small, not particularly influential. Sorry, Jen, I know you love the Quakers, but that is an apt description of them. Lovely, but not hugely powerful. But I always have to ask myself the question,
how much of the gospel did you give up in making that shift? And how much were you willing to give up really on the bodies of Black people in order to have influence with white people? I don't have good answers to that question, but it's one I do want to think. I always want to have myself think about. I mean, again, I'm an incredibly moderate white woman. Like, I actually like Joe Biden because he's boring. I'm just an incredibly moderate human being. But I worry sometimes that our drive, particularly when the drive for unity is about white people bridging over their differences, consistently comes at the expense of non-white people. Like, white people find a way to stick together, and we do it by saying that the calls to justice that non-white people are making are something that we will say are matters of polite disagreement.
If I can cut in a little bit, similar to that point, Sarah, and one of the hobby horses that I have from church history is looking at like 19th and 20th century Christianity and the development of it, and particularly development of the global church. And one of the things that I think is actually most interesting that happens in the 20th century that is unique to the 20th century is combination and recombination of denominations. And to also get back to my favorite hobby horse of the fundamentalist modernist controversy, I wonder how uncritically some of that recombination was done theologically, this is like a little tangential to what you are what you've said, but it's where my mind went, which is how gleefully people patted themselves on the back for agreeing with one another enough that we could be in the same room, and how much that was driven by white Christians wanting to get along with other white Christians, and how uncritically that was done sometimes, to the point that, like, you've essentially seen in the early part of the 21st century a lot of denominations redividing over a gender-related issue because they thought they had solved this one issue. Similar to how I think we've seen political movements utilize the South and a lot of culture war things. You can look at American recombination after the Civil War in a very similar light, I think, which is like, the most important thing is that we find a way to be polite, get in the room and get along, not that we critically examine our beliefs around these issues. And therefore saying vision, like the appearance of unity is more important than actual unity in thought or opinion. So we're willing to paper over a lot of stuff we still disagree about and just make that the stuff we don't talk about. And I just see that as a pattern that you can identify both in the church and in the wider American culture in particular, that really resonated with me as we were, going through this latter half of the series.
Yeah. I'm sure this is a comment or a line that other religious leaders have. I was always attributed to John Wesley for me growing up because I was a Wesleyan, but a statement something like, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, diversity, in all things, charity, right? Which sounds great. It's great, I love it. Except then you have to figure out what the essentials are. Right? If we agreed on the essentials, it would be easy, right? And I think, I think, David, there's something to that, this sort of sense that when we go into the, the politics or something, that's really the conversation we're having. No one's really out there saying, well, we should really compromise on our essential beliefs, right? What we're fighting about is what's essential, and when have you, even without necessarily saying it, trespassed over something that's essential, right? And so, when you combine, people are saying, well, these are the things where we're diverse when we agree on the essentials. So what are those essentials? What do they include? What do they not include? And, to what extent in this conversation, just how we think about,
you know, if you want to think about it, what bearing the image of God means, right? I had when I was in divinity school, we had a professor who was part-time. He came for half the year, but his name was Peter Story. And he was a white Methodist bishop from South Africa who had worked with Desmond Tutu in the anti-apartheid movement. Incredibly impressive, incredibly intimidating man. And this may be old hat for all of you, but I had never heard it before. But he told the story of Jesus and the coin and being asked about, you know, rendering unto Caesar, right? And he was interesting. He said, you know, everyone reads that as a statement about whether or not you should pay your taxes. And he said, I like, you know, coming out of South Africa, I read that much differently, where what's on the coin is the image of Caesar, right? So you render to Caesar the things that bear the image of God. You never render unto Caesar the things that bear God's image, which are people. You can never render that to Caesar, right? Anything that denies the image of God in somebody is something you cannot render. Right? And I remember being very struck by that, and then going back to this, I mean, for him, that was an essential. If what you were doing denied the image of God in somebody, you were rendering unto Caesar what did not belong to Caesar, whoever Caesar is. But then we were just kind of back to the question, like, what is that, right? I mean, if you support redlining, are you doing it? I mean, is that the line? Is it lynching? Is it not supporting affirmative action? Right? You know, these are hard questions. Yeah, Andy.
Yeah, and what you said in your 8th video is true, though, which is that, like, very few people today think or will say,
nope.
Yeah, yay-hoo for racism, right? Like, everyone's against it. But people have very different understandings of what racism is and how it plays out and what it means to be against racism.
Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, superficially, we all agree on the essential, but...
Right, but when you start digging...
Yeah.
It's very different. And people rank that essential different. I mean, again, there, you know, people who are, you know, they have multiple essentials and they focus on different ones, right? Too, is part of it.
So I was wondering if this would be helpful to say, but I think I'll just launch out there in the deep and say it. It's been more than one person who has said this, and so it's not important that it was just a particular statement. But when it comes to issues of the moral issues of abortion, for many people of color, it's not that they're not pro-life. But the question has been raised for the people who are so pro-life, what happens to that child of color once they're born? And that's where people say, so the same people who advocate, many of the people who advocate against abortion don't care about the person once they are here around the injustices that they have to face, whether that's with the penal system, whether that's in legislation, whether that's in the structural racism that's systemic. So what happens to that child? And so you hear this, and it really goes back to something that you've said. So when people think about what's essential, there are people who will vote with a party that they may not necessarily agree with abortion, but they're looking at that other part of what happens with a person having the right to live. And so if that party can represent a political perspective that goes beyond the wound of the mother into life, they're going to support that party, even if they do not support abortion in itself.
Yeah. And interestingly, that's, I mean, technically the way that, as I understand it, and I may misunderstand it, but as I understand it, that is the way that Catholics are taught to think about voting. That you say, you know, Catholics' position on abortion is pretty clear. You can vote for candidates who hold a different position on abortion if you're not voting for them because of their position on abortion, but because of other positions that you think will
play out differently. Like you're having to make, judgments about, various kinds of goods, right? And what would actually help towards the ends that you seek. Yeah. No, but I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, and again, part of what's interesting about back to the voting thing, is that when you begin to look at kind of the Democratic coalition, if you want to just take that party for a second, by and large, African-American voters are not on the left wing of that coalition, particularly on social issues. I mean, again, to go back to my favorite moderate, like the reason Joe Biden is the candidate is in large part because of African-American voters. I mean, not only, but partly, right? And so I think that recognizing that people are making kind of hard judgments, right, about kind of what they see as the aggregate good, right, rather than just individual goods, right, or just or litmus test goods, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, this is a little off the subject, but I was at a church for the last couple of weeks, and there was a man there who started a question. Always a great way to start a question. He's like, well, how can the Democrats, be okay for our country since, they're, so ungodly. And I said, well, like, you can be a part of whatever party you want to be. I do just want to point out that the Democratic Party does have as one of their core constituencies some of the most reliable Christians in the country who are Black women. Like they have they also have as part of their constituency a growing number of people who aren't religious. So they have the least religious constituency and one of the most religious constituencies. And that's just worth noting. I don't know that he believed me, but it was, it was interesting. Yeah. None of that, though, Andy, gets to your question about how to hold things, bringing people together, right? And I'm a historian, not a pastor for lots of reasons, but like maybe that question is one of them.
These are the things that keep me up at night. Yeah.
Yeah. But I would say, one of the things that I think, so that I hear in my circles as people who are Christians who are also historians looking at this moment. One of the things we're asking a lot of questions about is about formation, right? The question of what was the formation that happened that has gotten us to this moment on both sides, if you want to put this on sides, right? If you want to go on a left-right side, right? What's the formation that gets people in some cases to, if not explicit racism, at least seeming a lot of acceptance of implicit racism, right? On the other side, what gets people to this point where they're almost sometimes gleeful in their disdain for the other side, and maybe that's true of both, right? Both sides, like what formation got us here, and how do we do it differently? They don't have great answers to that because they're historians, but
yeah. I'm not gonna put forth Marxism as the answer because that would be kind of like ridiculous. But I've been listening to and reading some books about some real critiques of Christianity and how it's interacted with industrialism.
Yes, I know. My husband is now listening to that book online because of you, I think.
What's that?
I think Todd is now listening to that
book.
Yeah. This is a book called The Enchantment of Mammon?
Yeah. The basic premise of the book is that since the Middle Ages till now, that like capital, that mammon, like has become a religion, that we do not live in a secular age. We live in a deeply religious age where our religion happens to be capitalism. 800 pages long,
Or 35 hours if you're listening to it on audiobook, apparently, according to my husband.
It took the guy 20 years to write this thing. So it's
should have given it to Jim on his way to Arizona.
Yeah, right. Get it done, Jim, in one trip. It's fascinating, of course, and the guy winds up being critical of Marxism too, but there's a lot of criticism coming from that perspective. Mm-hmm. And, you know, from a Marxist point of view, like liberalism is wanting. Like there's things about liberalism, and particularly the kind of liberalism that's present in the United States or Western Europe, that's thin. Like it doesn't demand or expect much of human beings, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. Our social contract is meant to be a contract that focuses on personal liberty, mm-hmm. and kind of the contract you would make kind of assuming the worst of human nature. I mean, there's a whole range of reasons why I think the liberal side is thin, mm-hmm. right? But there's something about the liberalism that we put forth, the secular liberalism that we put forth, that is wanting. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to investigate mm-hmm. those and interrogate those assumptions about human nature, about our economies, about what it means to be a good person, that lend themselves to a theological critique that has nothing to do with a conservative white historical perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, and for me, it's more comfortable because politically, that's where I am more. Like I can't do anything about the Southern Baptist Convention, but I think we can do more to sort of question our assumptions about what does it mean to be a human being? How do we structure our economy? What are human projects? You know, I think virtue ties into this, which is why I've been focusing on that. Like, we don't really have the best political theory.
Sure, right. Mm-hmm. And maybe part of it, I mean, and this just gets to my hobby horse about religion in general, but I mean, I think maybe part of the call of the church is to be more interesting than what's on offer elsewhere. And by interesting, I don't mean cooler, right? Which is a lot of what high school youth groups tried to do in my generation, right? Like, I'm not asking people to out MTV or like YouTube the world. Obviously, I'm just showing my age that I don't even know, is MTV still cool? Who knows? But I mean, I think, Andy, what you're onto something there that I think, so one of the theories that I've seen, and I need more evidence of this, is that a lot of the people who are the most sort of nationalist right now are also in very weak communities. Like white nationalism is most powerful where community structures are weakest. Now, I need more evidence of that, but it's at least an interesting idea to me, right? And that maybe part of what the church has to offer is a really interesting alternative understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be in community, what it means to live life together, right? And not in a way that's hostile or looks down or on other people or is arrogant, but is really an invitation to being like, your problem here is not that you're bad. Your problem is that you're being told to be insufficiently human. And there's this better, more interesting thing on offer that we have.
Right. Yeah,
but we have to have it on offer.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I'm grateful for the exploring religious questions and what we've discussed there. And I hadn't really ever thought about Christian nationalism. Mm-hmm. And to have the author of that book speak Monday night was really, I thought, wonderful. And she's saying that Christian nationalism is not partisan, it's idolatry. Mm-hmm. And we've come to desire power and money and a self-sustaining machine and a global prosperity gospel. It just has a lot, I think, to think about in relation to what we were just talking about. So I want to read more about and she did a lot of traveling around the country and investigating what's in that book, Red State Christians.
Right. Well, and I'm almost out of time, so maybe we'll end with this. I mean,
John Calvin said that we are idol-making factories, right? Which is why he wanted to take down all decorations in church. But I think that, you know, the point is I think basically a sound one, right? Is that we tend to make idols in the absence of a really compelling God, right? Or we'll you know, and I think that one of the things that maybe has been true of the American church, to go back to Andy's point a little bit, is that, I don't know, I think sometimes we've had an insufficiently interesting God, and that makes it easier for people to make idols. You know, I always say as a parent, I have no control over whether my son will grow up to stay in the church or anything like that. What I desperately want to do is give him a God that's interesting enough and compelling enough that if he leaves, he'll have to reject it, and he won't just be able to convince himself that, you know, his culture or his money or something is that God, or that, you know, it's a God you can just kind of ignore. Like give him a God worth rejecting, right? If that's what you're going to do. And maybe that's not a bad hope for us, right? To have a God or a faith that is so compelling that you'd have to actually work to reject it. Which I think right now we have a lot of people who don't have to work that hard to either reject it or substitute it. I don't know, that may or may not be correct, but that's sort of kind of where I come down a lot of the time. All right, it is noon. I want to thank you all for doing this. I mean, really thank you. I did this project not knowing if anybody would ever care or use it or watch it. And I am really grateful that you took the time. That's very kind of you, because I know you are all busy people with many, many other things you could be doing. Just to throw this out there, I mean, right now I know we're not doing a lot of in-church stuff, but should COVID ever end and I can be useful in any of your churches or any groups that you know, I'm happy to do things via Zoom. I'm happy eventually to come in person, you know, when that becomes possible. If any of that is ever useful to you, I'm happy to do it. And if you know of other people for whom you think any of this might be helpful, please feel free to pass the links on, and I would make the same offer to them. I'm doing some Zoom sessions with different church groups. And so if you know of anybody who you think that might be helpful to, I'm more than willing to do it, because I do care about these conversations, and I'm grateful for people who are willing to participate in them, as you all have. So thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, thank you. And I don't know whether we might want to raise our hand or something to say thank you. Or
a nice Presbyterian nod.
Yes, a nod, something. It has been rich and challenging and enlightening, and thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for the episodes. They're very well done. And I just hope that we can continue to dialogue about these things. And so this is the last of this series, but it does not need to be the last of our conversations. And we may see that there's more to be talked about, especially as we work through this election period. I mean, I don't know how things will turn out. I'm looking at where we are as a country and the work that we have to do. And I am looking for the place for the church. You know, what is our work? I wish that more people would be willing to engage in the dialogue. I think some of what we have to do is to allow people to know that this is not about blame or judgment. It really does go back to how do we balance the many stories of history. And I really like that comment. And so those competing stories. Thank you for your time, and thank you everyone for being a part of the conversation. Go out and make disciples is what I like to say to people. And so Sarah, we look forward to sharing. As we said, we're going to share some things in the Valley Bridge that we hope that would be helpful and to point people toward the episodes. And let's see if we need to have a conversation again, maybe at the beginning of the year.
Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great